mercilessly tease and rib people all the time. He couldn't help exposing people's self-delusions and pretensions. It was just in his nature at that point. He'd seen so much of himself and so much of his students with all of the inner barriers and resistances and self-images that had to be broken down, that he was able to accept what was happening and not be that worried about what was going on with them. Nobody since him has really had the same stature as a public Thelemite. A number of the teachers, I mentioned David Shoemaker, my old teacher Jim Eshelman of the Temple of Thelema, and others have been out there, are out there, explaining all of this stuff, trying to get people to appreciate that this is a serious spiritual path, but it's different to what we had before. Yeah, there are times when we withdraw, we do mystical or magical retreats, we just go away from the world for a while because it's necessary at a certain point. But generally speaking, we're active in the world. Most of us have regular jobs or something approaching a regular, recognized occupation. We are involved in regular relationships with other people. We have families, blah, blah, blah. This is actually all being done in the world. Last Aeon, it was kind of like abandon the world, it's a disaster, it's a shipwreck. You need to extract your spiritual essence from the world, forget the world, and just go off and pray very intensely that you can be separate from all of that. Please let me not be tempted. Lead us not into temptation. Well, now we've got the opposite of that with this one. By all means enjoy for all things of sense and rapture. Temptation is fine. Was it Oscar Wilde who said that thing about some kinds of temptation require tremendous strength to yield to? That's not the exact quote, but allowing yourself to fulfill the parts of yourself that you've always been inhibited about realizing. That's a key part of what we do now. A mystery school is a specialized approach to all of this. It is, yes, distinct from the world, and yet we're obviously accessible. We make ourselves available. We are looking for people who would be interested in joining us in order to follow a certain program of training and self-exploration. We're using a very old system from the old Aeon. We're working through the alchemical elements in ourselves in a series of graduated degrees of increasing intensity, each one of which is designed to take apart bits of ourselves. And there's a recapitulation here. I was talking earlier about the Nefesh and the Ruach, and you need to go through the Nefesh stuff. Like, oh, what's going on down there? Is the instinctual self operating okay, or are you really dealing with a lot of repressed material, a lot of inhibitions, a lot of anxieties? Not that we're trying to resolve anybody's problems, but you do need to become aware of what those things are. Know what's happening inside. If you know what's going on, and you've got the idea that none of this is bad and has to be fixed, it simply has to be brought into the sphere of awareness so that you can choose how you deal with it, then you've got a psychologically sound approach. Sometimes, yes, this brings up a lot of difficult material. I know a lot of people who come into the mystery schools who end up going for psychotherapy in order to deal with really intense stuff. I can't see anything wrong with bringing somebody to the point where they say, hey, I need some serious professional help. It's an increasing consciousness. That's all we're talking about here, a constant expansion of consciousness from an animal self to a self-aware individual to a spiritual being to whatever awaits us ultimately. That's what we're trying to do. It's a slow process. People come in and they think, oh, I hope I can get through this really fast and, really find out exactly what I am in 3 years. Without what we call the first order, where you're going through these degrees, and our system and the precursor order that I was part of, it took me about 9 years to work through it all. Not because I didn't know who I was, but I hadn't really seen clearly all of the different bits and how they came together. Some people have done it in half that amount of time. It seemed like a bit of a failure at the time, but I think what happens if you take a long while about this is you really get to know the territory, and you make sure there's no part of yourself left behind. Doesn't mean you fix everything. It means you know the vehicle that you're working with. This is one of the commonest mistakes I find with people in any spiritual path. They want to get away from themselves. I have these fears, I have these anxieties, I have these inhibitions, I have these dark thoughts, whatever they are. And I want to get past that. The whole idea of exploring true will is about getting in touch with that and reaching a point where it doesn't matter a hell of a lot to you what that component of your personality is. It simply falls into its place, and then you get a bigger comprehension of who you are, where you're at, what it is you're trying to do. Magic is an odd thing. Most scholars would have said it was over centuries ago, because it was very poorly understood. Yes, there are all kinds of things you can invoke and conjure up. Whether those are from some very deep stratum of the psyche, or whether they are something entirely separate from the magician, is a topic that is actually far less interesting than you might think. You can get into all kinds of arguments about this. I see people online who say that magic is just yelling at the walls, and you're in this dark room and you're tracing pentagrams around you and visualizing archangels, and it just seems like you're doing something lunatic. But you're not. You're setting up a theater of the mind. Whether there's an objective reality behind this or not, you are contacting certain fundamental dynamic forces within your own being as you do this. Now, I happen personally to think that there is more than anything personal involved when the magic goes right. Something seems to come back to me from the outer universe. It might just be that I did a really cool ritual and the next day I run into somebody I haven't seen in months, or some letter I've been waiting for that got lost, and I live in Mexico, so believe me, mail gets lost for immense amounts of time. Suddenly it shows up. It doesn't matter what it is, certain events happen. When I was initiated in 1995, I felt really cool the next day, and got a phone call from the woman who was looking after my own mother to say, your mother went into hospital yesterday, she won't be coming out. She'd been ill for about a year, I was expecting her to go. But the fact that she actually went into a coma the same afternoon I was getting initiated seemed to be related to birth processes. It was the universe telling me, something quite serious happened yesterday. You went through a cool ritual. That must have been fun, but guess what happened? Something in the mundane universe came about in response to that, or in synchrony with that. And any magician gets used to this. But the key thing always is not so much about the universe doing things in response to our magic, but ourselves learning from the magic. Magic is just a repetitive process in our type of school. It's something you keep doing, the same thing, day after day, month after month, for a certain period of time until you move on to the next step. It triggers certain, as we call it, alchemical processes in the individual. It just starts your being looking at things from a certain angle, bringing up certain things that were buried before, and you get to see it, you get to know it, you get a guided tour of your own psyche. So at the end of all of this, you actually do know what your will is about. You can see how this fundamental core will, this core truth inside you, is expressed in the different levels and different aspects of your own being. And you have to go through something like this in order to have more than just an intellectual knowledge. So yes, magic is an ancient technique, but it still works very nicely. We combine a lot of more modern ideas with it. A lot of modern psychology is incorporated in the teachings we use in the mystery schools. A lot of philosophical knowledge, a lot of knowledge of other spiritual traditions is coming. We borrow jargon hand over fist from Buddhism and Hinduism because they've got some really neat know-how over there. We believe in technology transfer. We're not stuck in a bubble. At a certain point, it will coalesce. Ideally, it happens exactly in accordance with the official program, but for some people it happens faster. For some of us it takes longer to pull it all together. I've seen people leave orders and wander off on their own for a few years, just letting something stew in the back of their heads or down in the pit of the stomach or whatever part of the astral anatomy that seems to be appropriate, until they eventually say, you know what, there was something I never understood back when I was with you lot. Could I come back in and rejoin? It's really interesting, the people who do that, because obviously they had a very deep link, but they needed to take the time for it to stew until they could come back in and say, I'm going on to the next step. That's the private path, as much as you can really describe the thing without getting so personal about it that you're no longer talking generally to people. You're just talking about your own experience. Public movement. As I said, I got stumped when I tried doing this thing at first, and I still am